a lawyer and an agent and worked for both Jim Patterson and me as representatives both over the years, came to see me fairly early in the year and said, you know, I've been trying for 15 years to get you to write a mystery ever since you left the White House, because I read literally, I don't know how many, dozens and dozens every year. And you've never done it. So would you consider doing one with James Patterson? And I said, well, sure I would, but why would you do one with me? He's the best-selling author in the world, and why? So anyway, he said he would like to because he wanted to write an authentic political thriller. So we talked about it, and I thought, well, this would be fun for me because I'd like to see how you organize and execute these books. Because, you know, he turns these books out. I've read the Alex Cross series and the Michael Bennett series, which I particularly like. I love those books. And he's got a new female character, Harriet Blue, who's an Australian detective. He's got a brother in prison for murder that she's convinced he didn't do. And at least after the first two books, we don't know whether he did or not. So, could be about something else. But anyway, so I also said, but if we're going to do this, let's try to take a big leap and see if we can have an exciting thriller about something that's a legitimate problem. And that's how we started. So we talked about how to begin. And he said, well, if we're going to do this about cybersecurity, and it's going to be authentic about the White House, I don't even know where to begin. Here are 20 questions I have. So he said, you work on these questions and I'll send you a draft for a chapter. So we swapped drafts for the first two chapters probably 6 times. And believe it or not, we're both almost exactly the same age. We're both 71, about 272. I'm a little older than he is. I'm a little older than everybody. We did it, you know, and meanwhile, I put together how would the president go missing physically, what are the procedures involved, how is the White House organized, how are these procedures made. And we set out to do it. And it was a hoot. I loved working with him. I came to admire him. He's an old-fashioned patriot. He grew up in Rhinebeck, New York, which is, or what happened, which is the town that was George Washington's Revolutionary War headquarters, where he grew up. And President Eisenhower came to his hometown when he was 9 or 10 years old, and he never got over it. And he loved it. He said nobody ever came to our hometown. So, you know, I love getting to know him. We'd played a round of golf before, but we didn't really know each other. And that's how we did it. And it was fun. I think it was fun for him. I know it was fun for me. I learned a lot, and I think we'll have to see how well the book does over a period of time, but we tried to make a genuine thriller that had legitimacy in terms of its political credibility, how it was put together, but also it's about a very important subject. Cybersecurity is a big deal. Well, you know that, right? Atlanta was hacked by a ransomware. So that's how it started.
Well, and I should say, we'll see how the book does, but we could already go ahead and say that it's the #1 New York Times bestseller and the best-selling hardback since 2016. So speaking of cybersecurity, the plot obviously is focused on an enormous cybersecurity terrorist act. And I think for those of us who are not experts, can you give us a little bit of a sense of how much of that is possibly nonfiction, and what should we think about as it relates to the reality of the possibilities that are portrayed in the book?
Let's start with what it's not. Ever since I left the White House, I have not taken national security briefings unless the then occupant of the White House asked me to. Like President Bush 41-3 asked me to do a thing or two, and I was briefed. President Obama asked me to go to North Korea and pick up, bring home 2 American journalists, and I was briefed. But I didn't think I should do these briefings, even though every former president's entitled to them. Because Hillary was on the Armed Services Committee when she was a senator, and I didn't want people to think I said something based on inside knowledge to complicate her life, and then she was Secretary of State. But there's a lot of things you could say that are just factual. And in 1997, in my second term, I issued what I believe is the first executive order on cybersecurity. And we set up a cybersecurity division in the National Security Council. And was headed by Richard Clark, who was kind enough to help me on this book. So the basic idea behind the book is everything is digital or analog today, and anything that's electric can be hacked. Anything. So what would you do if everything got hacked? Plus the backup systems. Could that happen? So I called Dick Clark, and I read his most recent book, and I read Ted Koppel's most recent book, and then I went out and did a lot more research just to make sure I was current. And I saw Clark in Washington the other night where we did one, and I said, how'd I do? He said, it's understandable, and everything you got in there could happen. So that's what I wanted. I wanted you to think this is a big deal. Our defense budget is now more than $630 billion a year. Our cybersecurity budget, as reported, is about $15 billion a year. Now, there are items, for good reason, with some vagary, in some of the national security and intelligence budgets, which might take that figure up to $30 billion. But in any case, it's almost certainly less than 5% of what we spend on traditional defense. And I think it's way more than 5% of our security exposure in the world.
So we have seen in our most recent presidential election a direct cyber attack upon American democracy by the Russians. There was a portrait in the book of a Russian involvement in the cyber attack. Do you feel that we have taken proportional and vigilant action in response to those attacks? And do you feel the American people are galvanized appropriately around this issue?
No.
Keep in mind, we started on this book before the election in 2016. After the election, I became more convinced that we should do it because I believe whether you're really concerned about Russia and hacking the election as polarized as America got may depend on who you voted for. So I think a lot of people that supported President Trump probably think it was fine if Putin helped him win. But who cares? But you should care. And I don't think we've done anything like what we should. The federal government has a permanent staff designed to help people secure their election systems, and only 2 states have taken advantage of it. It's like they'd be embarrassed to say that. There are states that sign contracts with voting machine companies that say you can recount the votes all you want, but you have to promise you will never open the machine and examine the software to see if it's been tampered with, because that's our proprietary technology. Which means my little commercial interest is worth more than your constitutional right to vote. This whole thing is nuts. And Virginia, which as I understand it, was using the same machines you use in Georgia. The then governor, Terry McAuliffe, sent a voting machine to the annual Hackers Convention in Las Vegas. And with his expert, it took him 6 minutes to hack it. And they said if they had 2 or 3 more minutes, they could rejigger the totals in every single election that the machine permitted you to vote in, and people wouldn't be able to tell. Now, so what they did was to go to the system actually we have now in New York, which is paper ballots, you mark them, and then they're scanned electronically. But in a close race, you can take them all out, and real people with one observer from each party involved can monitor the count. And they had 4 real close elections in Virginia that had to be recounted, and the only dispute was in one where it came out a 1 vote difference. And the judge just gave another vote to the other candidate, and then they had to do it again or something. But the point is, there's a lot more confidence in it, and you can count them just as quickly. The Canadians use paper ballots entirely, and they count their votes as quickly as we do. But you should care about this, even if you think the hackers of the world are on your side. Because first of all, because they're not. They're not doing this because they care about you. And they're not doing, and the range of hacking options is not limited to elections, as Atlanta found out when you had this ransomware attack. We've had, just in the last several years, the Chinese and the Russians, who are probably the best at cyber offense, although the Russians use a lot of contractors, mostly lone geniuses, not only from Russia, but from surrounding countries. They've hacked the Defense Department computers, the State Department computers, and some of our national security computers. But anything can be hacked. The electrical grids can be hacked. Your banking records can be hacked. And if you can get to the backup systems, you can actually erase records. And so, if you lose your 401k, doesn't much matter whether you're Republican or Democrat. This is something America should get a hold of. We've got to find a way that the benefits of information technology and drastically minimize our exposure to the problems of it.
Switching gears, one of the issues in the background of the book was it mentions North Korea. In the last few days, all of our attention's been on the summit. I'm wondering how you would evaluate the most recent summit with President Trump, and how you'd handicap the chances of denuclearized North Korea going forward.
I don't know the answer to the last, because there weren't enough details in the communique they issued for us to know. But I think, whatever your politics, you should be glad to met. That's what I think. I think it's important that you understand what the actual threat from North Korea is. A small country of, 20-some million people that can't feed itself or stay warm in the winter without help, but is good at making bombs and missiles. Sounds weird. Partly it's because of the topography of the country. It's very mountainous. And partly it's because they haven't modernized any of their economic processes. So the reason that you don't want them to have nuclear weapons and really good long-range missile technology is, one, they know if they use a nuclear weapon, it's the end of their country. So that's not as big a danger as them selling the technology from the missiles or the fuel. If you have nuclear weapons, you have to have extra fissile material, the stuff that makes the bomb go boom. And if you have that separate, you can make small, dirty bombs or suitcase nukes, and they can cause a lot of damage. And if you can't feed yourself in a type, you might sell that stuff. That should bother you. But the dictators club in the world today now believes that if you want to stay in, even if people hate your guts, the one sure insurance policy is nuclear weapons, because they believe they can convince the rest of the world that if they're going out anyway, they might as well take as many people with them as possible. So, for example, they believe that Ukraine made a mistake when I was president and Boris Yeltsin was president of Russia. I convinced the president of Ukraine to give up his nuclear weapons, and under something called the Nunn, and Senator Nunn's here tonight, and they put all their nuclear weapons. One of the best deals you ever made, but they put all their nuclear weapons into Russia, into an international inspection site. And to the best of our knowledge, nothing bad's ever happened. But Vladimir Putin decided not to honor Yeltsin's commitment never to mess with the Ukraine's territorial integrity. So he took Crimea and sent forces into eastern Ukraine. They believe, the Dictators Club, that Putin might not have risked that if they kept nuclear weapons. A lot of people believe that Gaddafi would still be ruling Libya if he had not given up his nuclear weapons to Tony Blair. I don't necessarily believe either one of those things, but I'm just telling you they do. So Kim Jong-un is sitting there thinking, I'm running a military dictatorship. I killed a bunch of people to get in power, to solidify my power, and to show the military I was serious. If I give up all my nuclear weapons and my missile technology, what have I got to show for it? How did we get as far as we have? I think two reasons. One is the president of South Korea is the first president since Kim Dae-jung in my second term who actually wants to get along with North Korea and doesn't want the whole expense and political headache of trying to take them over. So he's a hero in all this. If you believe, as I do, it's a good thing they talk. Because he got North Korea into the Olympics. They had joint teams, well, separate teams. And the only thing that's really disturbed me about this is that President Trump announced the cessation of our military exercises with them, apparently without talking to him in advance. Because none of this would have happened without him. He built up President Trump and built up Kim Jong-un and said, you two were made for each other and all that. This is not a bad thing. And I think it's maybe the only negotiations I could think of where Kim Jong-un might be willing to give up his nuclear capacity and his missile capacity because he thinks President Trump likes dictators better than Democrats. Small I'm being serious. Put yourself in this guy's position. He's running a country with a 21st century missile and nuclear capacity and a barely early 20th century economic capacity. So they meet and then they issue a message that's at best ambiguous. We know that America has given up the joint exercise for some indefined period of time. We know that Kim Jong-un destroyed at least the entryway to one of his missile testing sites as a gesture of goodwill. And so you'd rather have that than not. But I think it's really important that we should be more careful about saying how much better the 100,000 political prisoners are going to be now. Because he has 100,000 political prisoners. And I think we have to be careful with this. But you have everybody in the world and everybody in America should want them not to have fissile material. So there's no temptation to sell that. And should want them to get rid of their long-range missile capacity. And in order to make that work over the long run, They have to, and he wants the security that nobody's going to try to overthrow him. And the South Korean president has bent over backwards to convince him that he wants to help him grow economically, but he doesn't want to absorb the country. China, ironically, is in the same exact position. They don't want to take over North Korea. They worry about a flood of immigrants coming out of there. And so there's a chance this will work out. But you can't tell yet, because that one-page communique doesn't tell you what happens next. So what you should be wary of, we don't want to give away too much without getting anything. Because what everybody in the world needs is a North Korea that's moving toward a modern economy, moving toward a more open society, working with South Korea more on less of a tenterhook with Japan, being more stable, and so that China's not always called upon just when they do something wrong. But ask yourself this, and you will immediately see what the problem with North Korea is. If they didn't misbehave from time to time, would you ever think about North Korea? Don't laugh, think about it. So they're like a poor, hard-working family with 4 or 5 kids, and the youngest kid just kind of gets ignored unless he or she breaks the cookie jar. And I don't mean that in a disrespectful way, but that's the fact. But they're just as intelligent as the South Koreans, they're just more isolated. And so somehow, slowly, they need to be brought into a normal relationship with South Korea and their other neighbors, and they need to get rid of nuclear weapons they can't afford, really, and invest money in their people. So, what I hate to see is accept the police state that's North Korea forever, I would. But would I do it if I were president and the South Koreans were willing to, and the Japanese were willing to, and the Chinese were willing to, in return for you never having to worry about a nuclear bomb exploding even somewhere in the Pacific, and missile technology and nuclear stuff going to somebody else? Yeah, I'd do that. That'd be a good deal for us. And it would buy some time. It's the same reason I support the Iran nuclear deal. You can't tell what's going to happen in 10 years. Did you know 10 years ago everything was going to happen in your life? So if you can make a deal with enough years on it to make the world safer, we should support it, especially if the South Koreans go on. I'm happy they met. We can't tell yet what, if anything that wasn't mentioned came out of this, but we need to be pulling for it to work. It isn't good to be an isolated, angry little country with the ability to develop nuclear weapons and long-range missiles. That's a bad deal. So that's what we're trying to get rid of, and we'll just see how it works out as we go along.
So speaking of isolated, one of the dimensions of the plot in the book is to attack and thereby cripple the U.S. and make us far too concerned with our troubles at home to worry about the rest of the world, end quote. Do you worry about American withdrawal at this moment? And maybe some reflections about the latest G7 meeting and our relationship with our
I do. I mean, it looks like, unlike the Korean thing, which I believe, what's the worst that can happen with the Korean thing right now is that we don't get anything out of it, but at least we've reduced by some factor the misunderstandings between the country and our tendency to dehumanize one another. So I like it when people talk. But it looks like, if you look at the G7 meeting and everything, it looks like we're saying we would like to swap the alliances we have had since World War II, and in many of these countries going back well over 100 years, with democracies in Europe and North America, and Canada and Mexico. We'd like to swap out all that and be closer to Russia and China. And I'm all for working with Russia and China when we can, when we need to. But maybe I'm just too old-fashioned for this world, but my experience in an increasingly long life is it's a really good thing to have old friends. And you don't have to watch your back. And you know that when the chips are down, they'll be there. So I'm worried about that. I'm worried about letting our hemispheric relations like NAFTA. I don't mind them updating NAFTA. It's 25 now, a little more than 25 years old. After it needs some upgrading in terms of intellectual property protection and who's doing what where and a lot of other things. But to ruin our relationships with Canada and Mexico, it's not good. And I really don't get after everything Russia's done, why we would get mad at all of our G8 partners, G7 partners, over whether Russia should get back into an organization, the primary requirement of which is that you be a democracy, is beyond me. I don't understand that. Look, I got along with Mr. Putin in the year I worked with him. But I think when you have somebody whose interests are fundamentally different from yours, you don't have to pick fights with them in public all the time, but you have to be very blunt with them in private. I got along with a lot of these people because I never tried to embarrass them, but I tried to be brutally honest with them in private. So they didn't misunderstand you. And I think that ought to be America's clear operating strategy, what are our principles and all that. So, no, I want to get along with China. I've helped China get in the World Trade Organization. But do I think they've manipulated certain things to get unfair advantages in sectors of the economy? I do. So I would have been very reluctant to let them sell those cell phones in America again because they have proprietary technology. And they say now they're going to let us come in their company and monitor what they do with it. Why? Because they've already given the technology illegally against the contract they signed with us to Iran and North Korea. You go figure. I thought Iran was, according to President Trump, not trustworthy with the nuclear deal, but they've already given them the technology that's in these phones, and those phones are largely bought in America by working people with modest incomes, and they basically, depending on how they're rigged, could just be spying machines on every family that buys one. So no, I wouldn't let them do it again. I don't think that's a good idea, but I think well, you get it, it's just, we need to be, I like this Korea thing, however it comes out. We could hardly be worse off than we were. So I'm glad he's trying. But I think we throw away our relationships with Europe and our North American friends at our peril.
One of the quotes from President Duncan, he urges Congress to expand the definition of us and to use our power to achieve more noble and necessary ends. And I've heard you talk eloquently about the power of us versus them. And can you talk a little bit about that, maybe specifically with my CARE hat on in relationship to refugees in the world, 65 million people. We have let fewer in than ever before since 1977. And we also are looking at cutting our assistance to refugees that are living around the world.
Well, let's first of all, I think this is one of the primary reasons Donald Trump did as well as he did in the 2016 election, because he convinced a lot of people who felt alienated from the increasing diversity of America that immigration was a terrible threat, that Muslims and Mexicans in particular were a terrible threat, and that the dumbest thing in the world we could do is take any Syrians. So let me back up and say, I think every country has a right to patrol its borders and to control them, and an obligation to do so. I remember when President Obama was attacked by some immigrant groups as being the reporter-in-chief. But the picture that has been painted and sold to a lot of Americans is simply factually inaccurate. So let's look at this. Countries take in immigrants for two reasons, essentially. One, because they think it's good for them. They need the workers. Or two, because people are in trouble and they want their country to do their part and help them. The German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, was almost defeated in the last election because compared to every other rich country in the world, she took way more than her fair share of Syrian immigrants. But she did it because she thought Germany is the strongest economy in Europe, had an obligation to try to help deal with the biggest refugee crisis since World War II. So let's talk about that and immigration. Let's deal with straight out immigration. First of all, even though we were told we had to have this wall in Mexico from 2010 through the end of 2014, 150,000 more Mexicans went home than came here. We have the lowest cross-border traffic from Mexico in terms of people coming to live here that we had in 50 years, the last 10 years. And one reason is the previous president, Mr. Cobb, built 140 tuition-free universities. They graduated 100,000 engineers a year there, as compared with 120,000 here. And people like to stay home so they can get a job there. And so the people you see at the border, by and large, are people fleeing the narco violence from Central America, principally from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, because they have weak governments and they can't stop the activity of the narco traffickers there. That's who you see at these borders. And are there, nevertheless, a lot of people in America who are still undocumented immigrants from years past? Absolutely there are. Why is that? Because we have not passed an immigration reform bill since 1983. And in case you hadn't noticed, America's changed a lot. So it's crazy that we haven't done that. And that's just all politics. Because Ronald Reagan was not afraid, when he signed the immigration reform bill, he was not afraid to give people who were here paying taxes, working, and were law-abiding the right to stay and a path to citizenship. He thought that both parties should campaign to people without regard to their race, their ethnic group, or their background. In other words, he believed in the metaphor of America, the shining city on the hill. And I didn't agree with President Reagan on a lot of things, but he wasn't scared of it. George W. Bush tried as hard as he could to pass an immigration reform bill. And I supported him when he did it. But it didn't pass. But it's a good issue to keep people torn up and upset about. Here's what you need to know about immigrants. It's different from the Central Americans and the Syrians, the migrants, the people fleeing danger. Number one, the birth rate of native-born Americans is only at replacement level. For the first time since we've been keeping statistics, and that only goes back to 2000, we now have a job available for every person who's unemployed. And that's a good thing, although the workforce is now only about 62% of people, 63% eligible by age, and at the end of my second term it was 67%. But even so, there'd be a job available for every 2 Americans. If you had, in other words, whether you're unemployed or not, in the statistics, means you're unemployed and you're trying to find a job. So since we're not having babies, if we want to grow this economy, we're probably going to have to take immigrants. Number two, the crime rate among the native born is twice that of the crime rate of immigrants, including the undocumented. And the small business formation rate among immigrants, which benefits everybody who works for them, including the native born, is twice that of the native born. So does that mean we should give up on patrolling our borders? No. But it means we shouldn't be hysterically worried about immigration. And it's interesting, if you go all over America, the most anti-immigrant sentiment is largely in places that don't have many immigrants. And it's because there is an economic problem out there, but this isn't it. The murder rate among Muslims, including all the terrorists in Orlando, Fort Hood, San Bernardino, every one of them, you add them all up, Muslims are 0.9% of America's population, so the murder rate is 1/3 that of native-born Americans. So our Muslims have gotten a bum rap. Now, does that mean that we shouldn't monitor terrorists? No. But I think it's important to put this in some context. So now, what do you do about what Michelle worries about as head of CARE? You've got the largest number of refugees since the end of World War II. These people from Central America, a lot of them would be happy to go home if they were safe, if they thought their children could walk to school without being shot by a bunch of people trying to make money and getting drugs to America. So George W. Bush signed the law, not a Democrat, saying that we would take people who were legitimately afraid of their futures if they stayed where they were. I support that law. So if you want to, and one of the things President Obama tried to do was to process all such people where they live, so we wouldn't have these big crowds of people show up at the border. Syria is a special case. America should do one of two things. We ought to take our fair share of Syrians, or we ought to invest a huge amount of money by their standards, very small by ours, to create decent housing and safe conditions for people as close to where they live as possible. I have a friend from Canada who spent most of the last 4 years working on this. And he interviewed thousands of these Syrians coming out of Syria going to Europe. He asked them two questions: what did you do in Syria, and would you like to go home? More than 90% said, I'd like to go home. And almost all of them were working people or small business people. The Syrian population in America is heavily concentrated in and around Cleveland and in and around, just north of Detroit, around Dearborn. They are phenomenally successful by and large, and wildly successful business people, and they employ a lot of people who aren't Syrian. So in those places, if you went into an Irish bar and jumped on the Syrians, you might have a fight on your hands. Because their experience is different. So if you don't want to run the risk that 1 in 1,000 might be a criminal, then you should ask your government to do America's part and create a no-fly zone and whatever else is necessary to have camps that are free from shelling and bombing, where the children can go to school and people can go to work, and we can rebuild the country while we're waiting to resolve that thing. But to ignore it is cruel and unnecessary, given what we know about the history of Syria. Now, the us and them deal is that in 1992, when I gave my acceptance speech at the Democratic National Convention, I talked about us and them politics. I'm a white Southerner. I know all about this. I've been living with us and them my whole life. And I ain't a rich planter. I hope I'll be the last president ever to live in a home as a child without indoor plumbing. And by the way, it was only about a year and a half, and it's a great political story, but it's way overrated, is the way to put it. But I have seen all these people that, I disagree with politically in the last election season. They comprise, among other things, 25% of the people, the Scots-Irish, small-town and rural Americans, who have ever worn the uniform of the United States. In all of our conflicts going back to the Revolutionary War. And if your house caught on fire, you'd be glad if most of them were your neighbors, because they'd come in and save your kids' lives and come back and help you put the fire out. But claddish people are vulnerable to us and them politics. And us and them means, in order for me to win, you got to lose. That's great in sports contests, but it's a terrible way to run a modern economy that is complex and independent. So, I understand what they were mad about. It wasn't so much poverty in the last election. Median income of a Hillary voter was slightly lower than the median income of a Trump voter. But the Hillary voters, the county she covered, were about 64% of the nation's GDP. What kills people is when they feel stuck. And the stuck counties voted against all this diversity because they read about it and saw about it and didn't feel any of the benefits of it. They felt stuck. So, but we got to get over that. And they're right to be mad that we haven't done more to bring opportunity. But it's not going to help you to refuse to do a little bit to help the Syrians. It's not going to help you to turn these children away from our border when they're likely to be killed if they're stuck. That's what she does with her life. So what I think you got to do is find a way to slowly expand the definition of us and shrink the definition of them. That's America's whole story. And it's what we got to do today.
We have only a few minutes, but we've just barely scratched the surface. So I'm going to see if we can do a few of these rapid-fire questions. So one of the amazing things about this particular thriller is that you have the insight of a president as a co-author. And what you find is you have one impossible situation after another that the president has faced. President Duncan, what was the most impossible situation that you faced as president?
I think the most difficult things are when you have to deal with things that you didn't exactly run on and carry the ball on a massive domestic issue. For example, I ran on reversing trickle-down economics. And I said I thought we could revive the middle class and basically raise income for everybody. And I got there, and after I was elected, the government said, oh, by the way, the deficit's going to be twice as big as you thought. So I couldn't do everything I wanted to do right away. And then I didn't really run on, I talked about it, but what we were going to do in Bosnia, but you had 250,000 people dead and 2.5 million refugees, and it wasn't like you could pretend they weren't there. George Bush ran on restoring trickle-down economics and going after Saddam Hussein, but nobody asked George Bush or Al Gore when they were debating, what are you going to do if Osama bin Laden blows up the World Trade Center and attacks the Pentagon? So the biggest thing in general, and you can see this, our president faces this in the book, President Duncan, is when you're president, you need to do three things if you're going to do a really good job for the American people. You got to try to do what you promised to do when you got elected. Most presidents do, by the way. Then you got to deal with the incoming fire, the unanticipated challenges. And the final thing you got to do is look around the corner. think about things that will never get you reelected, but might give your grandkids a lot better life. I'll give you two examples. When I was there, I put GPS in the public domain. It belonged to the Defense Department. And I spent $3 billion of your money to sequence the human genome. It's the best money you ever spent because there's always been way over $200 billion in private sector economic activity. Plus, we're very close on being able to have real advances in Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and a lot of other things because of all this genome work. So, for me, what happened was I was confronted with high interest rates, stagnant growth, middle class income stuck, poverty rising, a polarized Congress even then, and I had all these other problems I had to deal with. So, but you just got to work. Every president finds that in some way or another. And you just got to show up.
We're glad you showed up. President Duncan is your central character is a virtuous and courageous president. I'm wondering, you've known a number of personally of a number of our presidents. Just a couple of adjectives that you might use to describe the attributes of the presidents that you've known, and whether they're sort of a composite of that brings you to President Duncan.
Most people I've known in public life, going all the way back to when I was the Attorney General and Governor of Arkansas, have been honest, hard-working, and well-meaning, even the ones I disagreed with. And yet, most people think anybody who disagrees with them now is a low-life slug. And that's complicating our life. But, as everybody knows, I became very close after we left the White House with President Bush 41. I mean, he was the youngest guy shot out of the air in World War II. And he's done a lot of great things for the country. And President Bush 43 didn't like me at all because I beat his dad. And I didn't blame him. But I've actually become close to him. And I've strongly disagreed with a lot of his foreign policy and almost all of his domestic policy. But we go around the country giving speeches together. And we run a leadership development program together with both Republicans and Democrats to talk about how to govern. And how the Constitution could have been basically subtitled, "Let's Make a Deal." So, for all of you that don't ever want that to happen, you need to re-examine that. And I've been really encouraged in a lot of these close races. The people who have won these races have been immensely practical people saying, don't listen to all this stuff they're saying about me. Vote for yourself and your community. Like Virginia, of all places, elected America's first openly transgender state legislator. A Democrat, who was held by a Republican for 20 years. And I don't know if you know this, but Northern Virginia is probably the most traffic congested place in America. It's hard for you to believe that. Rush hour in Atlanta, I know. But this woman was unbelievable. She gave us, she said, no, I don't want you to vote against me because I'm transgender. But I don't want you to vote for me because I'm transgender. I want you to vote for me because you can't get to and from work. And the other guys had 20 years to fix it and hadn't. Vote for me, and I'll get you to work on time and get you home in time to have dinner with your kids. Politics is about the people's business. And it's much easier to find consensus in the specifics of daily life than in what often passes for political discourse. So our guy is good. There's another interesting thing in this book, though, I want to talk about. The book opens with the committee deciding whether they ought to recommend impeachment of this president. And I know what you're thinking about, but this is different. This president admits that if he did what the congressional leadership of the other party thinks he did, for the reasons they think he did it, he did commit impeachable offenses for which he could be convicted and removed from office. He didn't do those things. But he has an emergency to deal with, and he thinks he can't tell the leaders of the other party the truth because he doesn't trust any of them to keep it secret, and he knows if it comes out before he diffuses the crisis will occur. And there will be terrible results for the American people. So he has to sit there and watch his popularity go below 30% and watch himself polarize every day, knowing that they've actually stated a case that would be right and that he can't put it right because he doesn't trust them to do what's right for the national interest. And that's how it starts. You can't run any important enterprise without a certain level of trust. Think about your own life. We are all more than our labels. Right? We all belong to different tribes. And when I talk about us and them, I don't want anybody to give up their tribe. I just want to make a little room over there for everybody else. And so a subtext of this whole novel is we're trying to solve this huge cybersecurity thing with the smartest people we can get. Every ally we can beg, borrow, or steal. Identify who did it. Take appropriate action. And we should be doing that together. It ought to be 100% of Americans in any position of influence pulling in the same direction. And it's not happening. And I thought about the other night, Senator McCain's very ill, and I don't know how many of you saw the special on his life, but we normalized relations with Vietnam when John McCain and I were together in the Senate. He was in the Senate, I was in the White House. And I couldn't have done it without him and several of the other Vietnam War people. And I appointed the only person in the Congress who was a POW longer than him to be the first ambassador to Vietnam after we normalized relations. That's the way America works best. And we need more of that. And we can't do it if you tell everybody how terrible they are all the time. You got to figure out a way to work together.
So, President Clinton, I think we're on our last question. And so the book portrays a devastating set of events, but a president who's ultimately hopeful and optimistic. And I think you have always emanated optimism. Can you give us a set of reasons and things that we should be optimistic about to close us out?
First of all, everybody that's dead against America for 200-something years has lost money. In other words, we go through fits and stumbles and go back. I'm really worried because this feels more like the 1950s to me, rather than rhetoric out here. I'm really worried because we're going through a period where there's no difference in, seems to be in fact and fiction, or people think facts are irrelevant. Only feelings and resemblance count. I'm worried about that. But look at our assets. In spite of what I just said about immigration, we're still relatively young compared to other rich countries. We have the best science and technology base. We have the most diverse population in a world where diverse groups make better decisions than homogenous groups or lone geniuses or lone authoritarians. We have every advantage requisite for the 21st century except a functioning political system. And one of the best things you could do for the people that live in small town and rural America that have been stuck is have a big national infrastructure program where not only it's big comprehensive, not only roads and bridges and all that, rural airports to start small factories where they would otherwise not exist. But affordable, rapid broadband for everybody, which would bring millions of people into the economy. And we passed on that in favor of giving me a tax cut. I think that was an error. I think it would have been better. I was for lowering the corporate tax to basically the international average. And I raised the corporate income tax when I was there, but I raised it to the international average, and now it's 10 points lower than it was. But I think we overdid that and underdid investing in modern infrastructure, because you could create another 1 million or 2 million jobs for non-college educated, hardworking people, making America more modern. And I think we should be doing that around the world. The Chinese think it's great that we like dealing with them in Russia and we could care less about Africa. They just built a railroad across half of Africa. So they hope we don't give a rip about Africa. Why? Because half of all the arable land not being tilled today in the world is in Africa. And because no matter what certain people said about African countries, those people are really smart, and a lot of those countries are growing and doing well. And one of the most popular things I did, which had bipartisan support when I was president, is pass something called the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which gave certain concessions to Africans to set things in America that would not have affected any jobs here, but gave them a leg up in trying to get into the ranks of middle-income countries. And we're just walking away from that. I think that's a big mistake. So that's what I want to say. Just remember this. Complex problems created by interdependence and a bewildering array of challenges. You will see in this book, if you read it, that I mean, it should really bother you that a couple of geniuses half the world away could shut your country down. And we'll spend no amount of end of money to have a world-class defense. And look, I support a lot of this defense bill that we do need more ships. But we need them because of the South China Sea and aggression in the Pacific area. And the Chinese would be better off if we maintain a presence there, because they can win the future with their brains in a peaceful way that will allow us all to go there together without pushing those little countries in Southeast Asia around. But to do all that and spend so little on cybersecurity is a mistake. Israel's a small country. They get half, or they have in many of the last few years, half of all the private investment in cybersecurity. That should bother you. We created the internet. We created the information technology revolution. It began in Silicon Valley. And why did we let this happen? Because we've been majoring in the minors and minoring in the majors. And we need what I would call inclusive tribalism. In other words, you should still cheer for Georgia Tech or the University of Georgia or wherever you're from. But that shouldn't affect what neighborhood you're willing to live in and how you treat people at work. The message of this book is you should be hopeful because America has all the assets in the world. You can't start any new thing that doesn't have a downside. Anything that happens as fast as information technology has got to open opportunities for bad stuff as well as good stuff. And in all the history of combat, offensive weapons always precede effective defenses. But we got to cut it down to zero in time gap. And that's what this is about. This is the job for people working together for what I would call inclusive tribalism. Keep your crap, be proud of your heritage. Don't change anything, but make a little room to recognize that our common humanity is more important and also the key to our economic, social, and political survival. And the biggest problem we got is dysfunctional politics. We got to stop trying to keep people from voting. We got to stop trying to count people. And we got to put politics back on the basis of doing things that are good for all of us instead of demonizing people and pretending they don't have half good sense. That's what I think. That's the biggest problem. I'm very optimistic about our ability to deal with all this. Even climate change, as big a problem as it is, the technology is going so rapidly now. I talked to a friend of mine who was the biggest electricity provider in the Dominican Republic, and he getting into clean energy a few years ago. Every time I see him, he thanks me because he's making so much money. Wind and solar, putting people to work. So it's good out there, but it can be a lot better, and you can be a lot safer. But this is something we got to do together. That's the ultimate lesson of this book. It's not just that we should invest more money in cyber defense, but that our best minds come from all over. And we need to do this together. I know we're out of time. I'll tell you one little story. I was asked to leave the campaign trail and spend a couple of hours in Morehead State. You know where Morehead State is? It's the easternmost university in Kentucky. It's about 42 miles from the West Virginia border. Because they are part of a global national partnership in nanotechnology, which is little bitty computer chips doing great big things. And these undergraduates, there were 12 undergraduates and 8 graduate students in this program. The 8 graduate students were from the Middle West, except for one from Ukraine, one from Vietnam. All the undergrads were from East Kentucky. Okay. So they're building communication satellites that weigh 8 pounds and cost $1 million. The average communication satellite weighs a few hundred pounds and costs $300 or $400 million. So I go up to this 19-year-old young man from Eastern Kentucky, and I said, and he's putting the nanotechnology for the satellite in a little box about an inch cube. I said, what's a container made out of? He looks up at me, he's got this real hillbilly twang, he says, tungsten. He says, tungsten does real well in outer space. I said, well, where'd you get it? He said, I made it here with a 3D printer. And so I said something, I walked off. He said, Mr. President, one more thing. He says, you know, people are making fun of your wife for saying we should have 500 million solar panels in the next 4 years. Don't let her do that. I think she's a little low. And I said, well, why do you think that? He said, well, before you know it, we're going to be making all of them with 3D printers too. It'll be just as good and half as expensive. Electricity will be cheap as dirt. It will all be free. Now, what does that tell you? This kid is in the heart of people that disagreed with him because they felt stuck. He didn't feel stuck. He was focused on the future. He was thinking about something he could do that would be good for everybody. And that's what we all have to do. We just have to get up every day and try to make something good happen. It's all there before us. And we can deal with this cybersecurity thing, but I was thinking, I'm very grateful to James Patterson for letting me have an internship in how to write a program. We worked very hard together. We had a great time. I love the characters we created. I hope you do. But the way we did that book is the way America works best. He brought what he knew, I brought what I knew, and we did it together. And we dealt with, and I hope we succeeded in making people aware. This is something, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, you ought to be able to call your member of Congress, your senator, and say, please, do something more, do more with this cybersecurity. This is not just about secure elections, although we'd like to have fair and honest elections. This is about how we live. And that's the way, if we start doing that with everything, you will just be amazed how good it'll be before you know it.
And best-selling author, #1 New York Times of The President is Missing.
Thank you.
June 13th, at the Cobb Energy Center, 2018, Bill Clinton. Have his book.